Okay, welcome to this video. My name is Dr. Chege, and we shall be talking about a very simple topic, the basic of tariffs. And in this video series of videos, we shall be introducing the concepts of either finance in context of current affairs, supply chain in context of current affairs, and to talk about or introduce the idea of basic tariffs. The preamble or the backdrop is Trump in the previous 2 weeks has come up with sweeping reciprocal tariffs, and the goal or objective of his tariffs is to bring back American jobs through very punitive measures of denying access to the American market. That's one. But the question is that the correct decision to make, economically speaking? Because when analysts look at the formula at which they used to arrive at the rate that will be used for each country, ranging from Vietnam, a very high percentage, Canada, another high percentage, China, the highest percentage, and so forth, what exactly was the basis of that formula? It missed the mark. But to introduce this whole thing, I shall be talking about it in several steps. And you have the first one is we want to understand how exactly do you grow an economy. That's one. Two, what was the goal of these tariffs? Three, why do companies move production into China or India or Vietnam or other countries? Four, when is the bargaining power tipped when you're thinking about imports and exports? Then five, we'll be speaking about why USA wants to lock out China out of the market. Then lastly, we look at tariffs as a strategy in itself and why Donald Trump missed the mark by a big portion. So if we think about it simply, how exactly do I grow an economy? Now, there are people that will point towards fiscal spending. That's one. Others will look at monetary policies. That's two. But if you were to think about it from a microeconomics perspective, and we take a Kenyan context and say, you have a company here, and we shall call it Safaricom. Safaricom did not have an existence in the country until year XYZ, and the minute Safaricom came into the market, they were able to employ at least 3,000 employees directly and over 50,000 employees indirectly. Now, when you're looking at this equation right here, it means that 3,000 people who did not have a job found a job as a result of Safaricom, and there are other 50,000 people who have found a source of income as a result of the existence of the company that we are speaking about. That means that income becomes a source of spending, and these two over here are the key things when we're thinking about economic growth. Because I have disposable income, I can be able to spend. When you can spend, you are able to spur production via the demand. So when spending goes up, the demand goes up, the production equivalently goes up. And this is the simplest formula of how you grow an economy, because most analysts will tell you if you take this and multiply it by 10,000, you have solved, number one, the issue of unemployment rates. That's one. And two, you have solved the issue of economic activity by making sure there's disposable income in circulation, which in a nutshell spurs production. I want us to ignore the aspect of interest rates, money supply, and so forth. This is the simplest way that you can do it. Now, therefore, when we are thinking about Trump's goal or Trump's objective, he's trying, in a way, even though he has not articulated it, to solve the issue of unemployment. And in his own assumption, he is saying that if we get more people employed, we'll be able to get more demand, and more demand will spark production, and the whole cycle will continue. And therefore, to him, he's looking at the manufacturing numbers. That's one. Or even the small businesses that are getting started as a result of the manufacturing. Do not forget this aspect that we spoke about here. There's the direct impact and the indirect impact. Kindly ignore the background noise. Now we continue and say this. Let me clear this out. So if we go back to this conceptual framework over here, then we can see that that is an objective that he has. And the main goal of how he thinks he can be able to get to this is by saying we need to eliminate deficits. Now the basics are this. Any export that you have to another country, in terms of your, let's assume it's a bank account, the country's bank account, as it was simplistically speaking, is a plus to your organization. I repeat, any export that you make is a plus to your country, and any import that you make is always a minus. Now the objective that the president has is make sure that they solve the deficits, and by deficits it means they are importing more, which is a minus, rather than exporting more, which is a plus. But the point which he misses is he does not understand why do companies move production abroad, and this we shall give in this discussion and say this. If we are looking at production numbers as it were, we would say this, and I shall use the company Apple. There are two key costs that will always affect the final price of any given product. The first cost is taxation, that's one, and the second one, which is the highest, is the labor cost involved in producing the product. So Apple is selling a product and it's called iPhone, and they need several things. One, a very good machinist industry. And America is not a good machinist industry, because when Steve Jobs wanted to change the glass from a polycarbonate to a pure glass, it would take a very long time using the American supply chain. But in China, it was able to change within weeks. That means that their CNC and the machinist industry is very, very advanced, and the knowledge is rich and broad. That's one. But when you're thinking about labor and you're comparing the countries, the labor market applies based on the principles of supply and demand. If you have a huge supply of machinist technologies or even hard labor that will be involved in production, the labor cost will go down. That's one. But if they are less in terms of the number of people within that economy that can be able to supply that skill, the labor cost goes up. That is simple law of supply and demand. When you're thinking about China and India and all these other countries, they have the largest population, and therefore it means in terms of labor cost, it is an advantage to them. The next thing is the minimum wage. When we are looking at the minimum wages within the Chinese market, they are way lower compared to the minimum wages in America. Therefore, to Apple as a company, it makes sense to go to China and move their labor cost lower in terms of production. The second one is taxes. If the taxes are very high, again, the final product will be very expensive. So Apple had to figure out a loophole within the ecosystem where they can be able to take advantage of a tax regime. And the tax regime is as follows. China is big on exports, but America is big on imports. China is big on production. America is big on consumption. It's a consumption-intensive state. Therefore, China, to foster exports, has given a simple rule. Exports will be done tax-free. This was the main advantage. And America, given that it's a consumption-based economy, had a tax rule that said if it is an American brand to import within the American market, it will be tax-free. Therefore, the opportunity is I produce the goods in China, export them tax-free, and import them into the American market tax-free, duty-free, tariff-free. I access the labor market, which is way cheaper than the American market. Therefore, the cost of goods sold or cost of production is reduced significantly, and this reduction will help me to access the global market. If I had produced the iPhone in America, it would be too expensive to become a competitive brand to compete with brands such as Samsung and so forth. So this is an opportunity that the American market, the American companies are always taking advantage of. So Apple decides to outsource their services to China using a company called Pegatron and Foxconn. But Tesla is also considering moving to the Chinese market, but they are considering insourcing, in other words, establishing their own infrastructure. So from this then, we can clearly see what exactly were the reasons. What exactly were the reasons that the American markets were moving towards the Chinese industry or the Chinese production industry? So we've seen how you grow an economy, and we've seen the logic behind imports and exports, and we've seen why companies move production. But the other thing is this: as much as you want to take advantage of the price, there are several risks involved, and these come from the bargaining power. When you tip it too much in favor of a certain country, you become a captive buyer to them, and this is one of the things that Trump is big on removing. Now, the only way we can see this bargaining power is we look at the numbers, and I have a data sheet here, and we shall take a look at it. And on this side, on the left, just give me a minute, let me shut off the phone. Sorry about that. So on the left of this chart, we have what exactly does China buy from the US, and on the right, what exactly is the US buying from China. Now, the reason why I want us to look at these numbers is simple. Bargaining power, in the sense of, if I cannot buy from another country, and I'm looking for the exact words here, if I can only buy from one country because of the technology involved, then it means I'm a captive buyer. If I can only sell to a certain country, then I am a captive seller. If we think about it, therefore, whatever China is buying from the American market is high on mineral fuel and oil, mechanical appliances such as nuclear reactor parts, electrical machinery which includes semiconductors, you have optical equipment, and so forth and so forth, until we get to the highest rate, which is organic chemicals. Now, when China is sitting down in their policy boards, economic policy boards, they are trying to ascertain what exactly can't we buy from another, from America, or what, in simple sense, which parts are we captive to America? And when we look at all these things that are being bought from the American market, there's only one which I can pinpoint and say, this one, China is trapped and cannot be able to diversify in terms of the supply market, and it is the aircraft and the associated parts, which accounts for about 50%. Everything else they can try to diversify. That's one. Now, if you think about what America is buying from China, the highest rate is, according to the source, the highest rate is consumer electronics that are at a whopping 22%. And these are the ones that Trump had to rethink and say, we cannot afford not to buy this from China. Therefore, for home appliances and consumer electronics, we shall keep them off tariffs and semiconductors. But most of the other things were kept on tariffs, and some questions were, is it temporary tariffs or is it permanent tariffs? But nonetheless, America discovered that they are captive buyers when it comes to consumer electronics, one, and home appliances. Does this mean that all the other industries that are tariffed will remain standing? No. If we look at the numbers that are coming in within the Chinese market, we can clearly see that there are some companies that are openly shutting down production and sending people home. But they are very tactical in the sense of what exactly can we touch and what exactly can we not touch. Now, the other thing that I want to echo is this. If you're thinking about a consumer-based economy and a production-based economy, these two over here cannot be compared in terms of bargaining power, because on the left, we only have one thing that we are stuck with as China, and on the right, we have several things that we cannot afford to diversify. Therefore, when Trump increased the tariffs on the products that were said, the ripple effect was the American confidence in terms of their economic confidence and credit rating shot down when Japan started offloading the bond market, and this we shall talk about in another video. So the Chinese market understood the dynamics of and basics of tariffs, and they basically opted to increase them all the way to 125%, and they said that they do not intend to increase them any further. Remember, the reason why we are using tariffs is to lock out someone from our markets. So when you charge 125% on a certain product, you are basically locking them out of the market. If anything, if you had only used 50%, some people are already locked out of the market. So the companies that will buy from the Chinese market as a result of that tariff are companies that are captive buyers, and they cannot get another country to supply the said product. So it's 125%, and the impact is already felt. So the question then becomes, why is it that China was very bold and audacious in introducing the tariff? You have to assume it's not a game of chess, as it were, but it's a game of power, and they understood who holds the power. Now, this leads us back to the thing that we're speaking about here. We've understood what we mean by bargaining power. That's one, and we've looked at the numbers. So when we are using tariffs, America's simplistic, and I'll introduce these two things at the same time. America's simplistic understanding is this. USA is exporting to China $144 billion. Those are the exports that USA is exporting to China. Those are the numbers. USA is importing a total of $439 billion from China. Remember the basics of tariff here. I want to lock out, make a product so expensive so that I lock out my opponent away from that market. So if I look at these numbers, the simplistic assumption that Trump's leadership used is China cannot afford to lose $435 billion. Therefore, if we introduce tariffs, they will be brought to the negotiating table so that we can get a better deal that will reduce the deficits. That is the thinking. That we hold the cards. If we lock them out, we hold the card. But to understand why China did what they did, you have to really look at the principles of exports and imports in terms of balance of payments. And this is the simplest definition. In tariffs, and this is a simplistic statement, in tariffs, the advantage lies on the person who has the surplus and not the one who has the deficit. Remember, Trump is thinking to himself, because we are buying from them 439 billion, they cannot afford to lose us. Therefore, we will force them to negotiation using tariffs. But the tariff principles are this: the person who has the surplus is the person who has the advantage. The person who has the deficit is the person who has the disadvantage. And let me explain it in a simple sense. China is giving up money. China is giving up money in terms of sales. And that's a very important distinction. China is giving up sales, which is money. They are not in deficit. USA, on the other hand, is giving up goods. And this is where the difference lies in. When you want to actually see who holds the power, the person who cannot do without those goods is the one who does not hold the power. And this is seen when we look at the data layer right here that we spoke about. America cannot afford not to buy from China in terms of consumer electronics and home appliances. That is the basic dynamic. China will only give up sales. Therefore, to compensate, what they can do is they devalue the Chinese yuan so that the electronic products that they can no longer sell to America, the semiconductors that they cannot sell to America, become so cheap that the African market, Russian market, and the EU market says it is so cheap we need to buy. So China has the flexibility of devaluing their currency so that they can get more sales. They are only losing a sale. And it's as simple as you lose one customer, you can always get another customer. But if you lose goods and you cannot get those goods elsewhere, you are the person who is the slave in that dynamic. Therefore, China understood this. And they knew if we lose sales, we can always find another customer. Now, the other thing that China understands is this. If you have a surplus, remember that if you export more than you import, for an import, it is a minus. If you export more than you import, you have a surplus. And this surplus is saved or invested. Now, if you have a deficit, then this number right here is already in the negative, which means you are spending more than you can save. You do not have anything to save. And that's the simplistic thing. If I give you a credit card, the money going out is more than the money coming in. Therefore, you are spending more and do not have disposable income upon which you can save. That means you hold no power at any point. You should never even try and negotiate. But the person who has the surplus, the money coming in terms of their exports in quotes, the income coming in is greater than the imports, which means they have surplus, and that surplus helps them to save, that's one, and helps them to invest. Herein comes the kicker in terms of strategy and where the Trump administration completely missed the story. China, when they sell goods to America, what they do is they do not bring these dollars back to the American market, to the Chinese market. Speaking of, they're buying 439, they are bringing $439 billion to their country. But these dollars are not coming to the Chinese market. What they do is they simply invest in US debt. They buy US debt. So if the US has what you call a US treasury, or they go to municipal bonds, or any issue from the Federal Reserve in terms of debt, they will go there and buy it from them. And when they buy it from them, therefore, it means of this debt, trillions of dollars in debt that America owes, they owe the biggest portion to China. Again, remember, if you have the deficit, you don't have the power. That's A. B, the person that you has the surplus does not take the dollars from you. They buy your debt. That's B. Which means you are their slave at two levels and you cannot afford to mess up. Therefore, if you look at the numbers online, the total US debt owned by China is over $735 billion. Now, if you think about this as the bond market and you want to see how American market was caught off guard when they made wrong assumptions about their power, it comes from this dynamic right here. And the dynamic is this. Japan are enemies, serious enemies, nemesis as it were with China, Vietnam, and Russia. There is more or less an animosity that does not involve guns and nuclear wars. But whenever they are thinking about business, they have to agree and say, for the sake of business, we need to speak the same thing. And the following are the countries: Japan, we're speaking of Vietnam, we're speaking of China, we are speaking of Taiwan, and we are speaking of India. Lastly, we are speaking of Russia. The countries that I've just mentioned are intensive on exports. Therefore, when Trump touched A, touched B, touched C, touched all these people, he was caught off guard, because what it means is this: Japan started offloading their US debt, and by selling their bonds. By selling bonds, it sends panic, because the simplest sense is this: if the interest rates are high, it means it is good to bring that money into the US market in terms of US debt. And that is what China has been doing. But the minute people start selling, again, the principles of supply and demand, the supply of bonds in the market increase and the interest rate goes down. And this creates a panic, because it shows the world does not have confidence in the American market. If the world does not have confidence in the American market, this will force other countries to start moving out of the bond market. And the more this happens, the more the Federal Reserve will need to do one thing: lower the interest rate so much that it becomes lucrative for each and every person. But when you do that to the world, it's a bad indicator. And Trump discovered this at the last part, and this is the ripple effect that they had not foreseen. If Japan created a crisis in the market already, if you look at the numbers, it is Japan that offloaded the bonds, and China has over $735 billion worth of debt. The person that holds you by the horns is China, because China has introduced 125% tariffs on very key things that you need. And two, Japan has created a ripple effect. So to avoid a total collapse of the stock market, the Trump administration gave a 90-day halt for the tariffs on any other country apart from China. And for China, they exempted the key products that they need. And the reason is that they discovered that the things are this: one, the person with the surplus has the power. That's one. Two, the person with the surplus is investing into your debt market. That's two. And three, there are alliances being formed with export-intensive countries, and they are starting to create a ripple effect that will drive you into a recession. So you have A, the person with the surplus. B, they have saved this into the debt market. And C, you do not have allies. And this is the geopolitical landscape that Trump has found themselves into. They have devalued everything, and their retirement accounts for 401ks and so forth have been torn to shreds. That's one. And two, as they are looking at it, they have created an A plus B plus C ripple effect that is a sure way in which they are looking at a possible recession, with Goldman Sachs' projection being more than 25%. Chances are high we are headed to a recession. But this is not your typical recession. This is what I am calling a tariff recession, and most analysts agree it is being triggered by the tariff war that has started. The question then becomes, why would you want to produce everything in American market when we can clearly see it is a bad thing because of one, the labor market, and two, competitive issues? And the reason is that, or I have said this in an earlier section, that if you produce these products in the American market, you better use them for the local and domestic consumption, because by price, remember, if it is a physical product, the key driver is price. By price, if price is the driver of your physical product, you have locked out American products from the whole world, because they'll be too expensive to access the Asian market, the African market, and Southern African market, or even the Russian market in some situation. So it doesn't make sense to force manufacturers to push them into fully producing in the American market. The proper way to do it is this: access the Asian market to produce inputs which are assembled in the American market, which keeps the cost of production very, very low. And again, the American companies are able to access the global markets. That is good for you. And that means you stop looking at the deficits. You will need the deficits to be able to make your companies competitive in the global market. The thing that you should be looking at is the total exports and not the deficits. And this is a very simplistic and proper way to think about economics. Don't look at the deficits, because you will need the deficits to make your companies in America competitive for the global market. What you should be asking yourself is, are the total export numbers good? And the total export numbers, as far as calculation goes, is the goods exported plus the services exported. That is the simplistic way. So if we look at these two numbers, is the American economy good? In 2023, they were able to have a total exports of $0.518 trillion. And this is an increase of about $396.5 billion from the year 2022. These numbers are very, very good, because it shows in terms of your total exports, you are doing good. The numbers are going up from this year to this year. And this is what should have led Trump to say, the numbers are good, simply leave the economy as it is, do not touch it. That's one. So in summary of everything that I am saying here, I'll give the last thinking, and this one here is this. I'm assuming that Trump is not as ignorant, and his advisors are not ignorant to be aware of the fact that the person that has the advantage has A, has B, and has C. Those are the cards that they are holding against you. That's one. So I suspect that Trump knows this. Again, he could be wrong. Most people on the internet will be basically saying this is the most unintellectual president we've ever had. But let's assume that his advisors are not as unintellectual as he's accused. That's one. Then it means his bargaining power is based on a political ploy called the dead man's switch. And what this basically means is, if you are fighting against a madman, or if you're fighting against a suicidal man, nobody will win. And this is true of tariff wars. There will never be a winner within tariff wars. There's some industries that will be completely shut down and destroyed and forgotten. That is fact. So China is not going to win even though they've done their calculations, right? And America is not going to win even though they did their calculations right. So I suspect the dead man's switch is what is supposed to scare Iran from the things that they've been doing, scare North Korea from the things that they've been doing. But for now, China has the cards, and Trump has been capitulating and giving concessions as a result of A plus B plus C. So the dead man switch theory is not good, because if America enters into a recession, the Trump confidence will go down, and chances are high, even though he owns the house, chances are high you might have the talks of impeachment, as it were. That's one. This is my thinking A. My other thinking B, if this man is as interested with power and money as it is, it could be tariffs was just a ploy to destroy the economy and have people have make millions and billions in terms of option puts and investment shorts and all those things, where the big companies or the big hedge funds are betting against the economy based on certain information and the information they are receiving. And we've been looking at the trail of thought in terms of how the put options are being placed within the stock markets, and this is before an announcement, and sometimes the market starts going up even though things show it shouldn't be good. Then all of a sudden we get a 90-day break. So again, some analysts are correct that this could be a money grab, or what we call a pump and dump, and they work. But a man who is as narcissistic as he is wouldn't be willing to do this at the expense of a recession. So there must be a point where he will call himself into a point of introspection and say, billions and billions are made in terms of these puts and these shorts within the stock market, but there's a point where we need to have a conversation and say, let's talk. And this is the point, this is a pivotal point where we are saying Trump would be willing to talk. But the worst thing in conclusion of this video is this. The things that have happened in the last 3 weeks are supposed to happen in decades. And my assumptions that I have given you right now might be laughable by next week, because the stock market might have reversed and recovered all the trillions of dollars that have been lost. They might be recovered within the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So a person must think to themselves, how exactly do you manage this on a bit-by-bit basis? But in conclusion, again, I hope you see the ripple effect that we're speaking about in terms of the geopolitics of international business, as it were. That's it for this video. Until next time, should be a wrap.